Hi again, guys, and welcome to another installment, of course, of the Beards and Cars podcast, which, incidentally, you can grab in its audio-only form via the SoundCloud link down below, of course. But this episode is one which I've been looking forward to doing for quite some time, but at the same time, I didn't know exactly what was going to be in this episode until today, really, because it's a retrospective, looking back over a pretty interesting first year for me, my first year of being a driver, actually being on the road, owning vehicles, insuring them, test driving them. For any of you who follow the Beards and Cars road test reviews, you will have probably seen that I've driven a lot of really nice cars over the past year alone. And I'm going to start talking about some of that as well. For those of you who might not know, I'm also a biker. I don't own a motorcycle, but I ride them. I've reviewed a number of them. And I also got my motorcycle license within the past year as well. And I'm going to cover these things basically in chronological order. Now, in terms of the motorcycles, it might be a little bit out of order in terms of what I test rode when. But the car stuff is what most of you will probably be interested in anyway. And the motorcycles don't come until later. Now, this story starts, as far as my first year, technically a little bit more than a year ago. I wanted to round this off from the time that I passed my test, which was May of last year, to now. And the reason why I'm doing it to now, and not until May, is because, put simply, on the 17th of this month, I'm beginning my second year of insurance on my car. So I've finished my first full year of insurance, plus the time before I bought that car, after I passed my test. So basically it's like a year and 3 months, a year and 4 months or something like that. But my first, in effect, year of driving. So immediately after passing my test, which was, for those who might be curious, yes, a full manual license. I don't drive any manual cars. In fact, I haven't driven a single authentic clutched manual at all since that first one. But that's because I'm lazy. It's not because I can't drive manual. As I said, I did all of my lessons and passed my test in one. I just don't like manuals. I think that the clutch pedal is the single most outdated thing on any car today. And I just think automatics are so much better than they used to be. It makes all kinds of sense. And I know that a lot of people don't agree with this point specifically, because most people who prefer manual tend to be petrol heads. But the thing that I actually enjoy the most about driving is not changing gear. The things that I enjoy the most about driving are actually steering and piloting the car through corners. And changing gear is only an element of that. To me, steering a high-performance car and feeling the throttle and the brake is far more fun than using the clutch pedal and changing gear. To me, that's just boring. Utterly boring to me. But with that to one side, after I passed my test last year, the first car that I actually drove, alone, on my own in the car with no person in there with me, was actually kind of jumping in at the deep end, because I hired a car, which some of you will have seen in a video, it's here on the channel, when I did a vlog-style video of Goodwood 2019. I hired a Mercedes, at the time, brand new Mercedes A180D. I didn't want that car. I wanted to hire a Skoda Octavia, a diesel, for 5 days. That's what I had it for, because I wanted to get used to the car, maybe drive it around a bit, make use of the time, and when you hire a car, you tend to get a better price if you hire it for longer. For instance, hiring it for 5 days cost me about the same as what it would have cost me to hire it for maybe 3 or 4 hours, as weird as that sounds. So I hired this little Mercedes for 5 days. It was a little diesel, like a 1.8, 2 litre, something like that. I believe a 7-speed automatic, might have been an 8-speed, but I think it was 7. And I absolutely loved it. In fact, to this day, having driven some incredible cars on the channel, that little Mercedes is still one of my favourite driving experiences, and I suspect that some of that is probably for sentimental reasons. It's also by far the most economical vehicle I've ever driven. I had the car for 5 days, I did over 600 miles in it in that time, and it cost me £30 of diesel. I've never matched that kind of economy in any other car. And I thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it. It was super fun to drive. The interior looks fantastic. I've actually contacted Mercedes multiple times about trying to get another one to review it. In hindsight, I wish I'd have reviewed the car while I had it, but, you can't change that now. So in a funny kind of way, that would have been the first car I ever reviewed. Instead, of course, and some of you will probably remember this, the very first car, real car at least, that I ever reviewed on the channel was actually the car that I drove next. After that Mercedes, on a different occasion, I went to a BMW dealership and asked them to test drive, the BMW i8 Roadster. You know, if you're going to go big, go big. Don't ask them to review something small like a 1 Series. Just go all in and say the i8. To my surprise, they said yes. Bearing in mind, I'd had my license for 3 months, and I'm in a BMW i8, brand new, 700 miles on the clock. It was the show car for test drives, worth £130,000 at the time. So it's one hell of a deep end to jump into, but I absolutely loved it. I had the car for 3 hours, which was fantastic. Of course, I did the review for it, still the first review that you can watch on the channel. You can kind of tell the camera angles aren't very good. I had the GoPro set up in a fisheye camera lens, which does not look that good now. I prefer a linear view instead of the wide angle, but that's all technical stuff. But the point is, you can see how my reviews have changed since then. It was still a lot of fun, and it's actually still one of my favourite cars that I've ever reviewed. And in terms of its value at the time, that is still the most expensive car I've ever driven, at 130 grand. If you compare the new prices of all the cars, it's not, but at the time, you know, comparing that new car to a lot of the used ones that I've driven, it's still more expensive. Then after that, we jump forward a little bit more in time to when I actually purchased my first car. That was in, I think, August of 2019, something like that. And of course, that's the car that I still own now, the vehicle which I've just renewed my insurance on for a second year, my trusty Volkswagen Touareg V10 TDI. My first car, still my car. It's been fantastic. Of course, I mentioned in my review, which incidentally is still the most successful car review I've ever done, real cars at least, with like 27,000 views at the time of releasing this podcast. I mentioned in that video that it broke down on day one. And at the time, I remember I actually hated the car. I hated it because I felt like it was a friend that had let me down, because I wanted to love it. Many of you know, because I've talked about it, that Test Drive Unlimited 2 made me want to own one in the first place. And I just felt like it was one of those times where you meet a hero and they let you down. The reality is, in hindsight, any car can break, so I don't hold any ill will against the car for that, and most of the stuff that annoyed me at the time was actually to do with the inept morons who were dealing with fixing the car, because the guy who sold me the Touareg actually promised that he would pay for anything that broke, and he did do that, because it broke down on the first day. The problem was, he took it to a dealership, or a garage, who he was clearly friends with. And this particular garage, I suspect he used them to get mates rates, regardless of how good the work actually was. And this garage happened to be changing location at the time. So long story short, I didn't get my Touareg back for 45 days. That's ridiculous, and all they ended up actually doing was fitting it with new air lines and a new air pump for the suspension, because that's what broke. The first day I drove it, I went into town, went to watch a movie at the cinema, and as soon as I drove off the driveway, after doing that car review, because obviously I recorded the review that you can watch, but then I did the audio for the review the next day. So by the time I recorded the audio, my voiceover, in other words, the car had broken. I pulled back off the driveway, and the car just sank to the ground, like literally slammed like a low rider. There was no suspension, I was bouncing all over the place. I still went to watch the movie, but obviously the next day I contacted him and we got the ball rolling. But these morons just took their sweet time getting around to it. And there are a couple of other things about the car that make me think that they were kind of trying to hide stuff about it. In particular, the bodywork, for instance, on the front of the Touareg now, and for quite some time, in fact, since coming out of the garage for those 45 days, the front quarter panels, the lacquer, is kind of split and peeling a little bit. And it's gotten worse over time, but I'm kind of a procrastinator when it comes to some things. If it were a mechanical issue, such as the suspension, then I get that fixed straight away. But when it's a cosmetic thing, I just don't really have the same kind of motivation. If I was selling the car, I would probably care. But when it's just me, I don't care that much. Because the car still does what I want it to do, it just doesn't technically look mint. If you see the car passing you, you wouldn't even notice anyway. But the point is, that was because, according to a paint shop that I took it to recently, it's because they used cheap lacquer when the car was sprayed at some point. And that doesn't surprise me. I don't know who did that, but it just doesn't surprise me. There are so many dishonest people in the automotive world. Mechanics are known for it. You know, most places, dealerships, car sellers and dealers are certainly known for it. And it's disappointing, but I come to expect it, especially because, again, for those who don't know, I'm in the automotive world myself. I am a mechanic. So I'm not dishonest, but I'm well aware that many people in that world are. So I've now got a Touareg. I've got my first car. I absolutely love it. But just like I am in Gran Turismo and Forza and Test Drive Unlimited, and I know many of you guys are as well, I'm a collector. I don't just want one car, I want to get more. I want to change the car, or I want to have a couple of cars, maybe a motorbike as well. At this point, I did not have a motorcycle license yet, but I really wanted one. At the time, though, it wasn't a top priority, so I decided to get a new car. And many of you know what that was. I purchased my Maserati, the 2005 Maserati Quattroporte, the one-off, the only one in the world in its colour, Ferrari Mirabelle Blue, custom, worth $100,000 when it was new. I bought it for $7,500, which is not an uncommon price. Quattroportes aren't worth as much now. And in a short time, I realised why. And I still love Maserati. They're still my favourite brand overall, but it made me cautious about buying another one. Because at the time of purchasing that Maserati, it was just a bad time in general. For those of you who don't know, I believe I did mention this in a previous podcast a long time ago. My old man had a stroke at the time, ended up being in hospital, and it was just a bad time to have a new car. Thankfully, the Touareg didn't sell, because if the Touareg had sold, and then I kept the Maserati, I would have ended up in a far worse position for a number of reasons. One, the fuel economy on the Maserati was horrendous, so travelling back and forth to the hospital every day as I would have used a ridiculous amount of extra fuel that the Touareg never did, and of course those kind of costs build very quickly. And when somebody's already in hospital, you don't really want to be adding more and more stress. Plus the Maserati was already showing signs of being unreliable, and it was just a better idea to use the Touareg. So I'm glad in hindsight that the Touareg didn't sell. And since then it's been nothing but great. I've had literally no reliability issues whatsoever with the Touareg. And the engine, the thing which most people are worried about, has never given me any issues at all. So I had the Maserati for, I think, somewhere between 2 and 3 months. And then I took it out to this car meet on one particular day and had a bit of fun with the car, showed it off. But then the next week, I believe it was, I started up the Maserati, tried to pull off the driveway, and I didn't really acknowledge it, but something felt kind of weird about the gearbox. So I put it into, reverse or whatever, and it stayed in neutral. And I didn't really give it a second thought, so I just let it roll backwards as I usually would. But then when I tried to put it into drive, after rolling down the driveway, which is fairly steep, I then couldn't move, so I was stuck in the middle of the road. The car wouldn't engage drive or reverse, it was stuck in neutral. It wouldn't work with the shifter, it wouldn't work with the paddles either. So I ended up having to get out of the car, trying to push it back up the driveway myself. Thankfully, a couple of other drivers got out of their car and helped me, because it is a 20-foot-long 2-ton limo, so it wasn't exactly the easiest thing to push up the driveway. I'm thankful that it wasn't the Touareg, though, because the Touareg weighs just under 3 tons, and that would have been borderline impossible. But with the Maserati, we managed to get it back up on the driveway, and then, miraculously, it just worked again. I turned it off, waited like an hour, came back out again, and then it worked just fine. But obviously my confidence in the car was understandably knocked. About a week after that, though, it just completely stopped working. The engine would, turn on just fine, still sounded great, etc. Nothing else was wrong, it just would not engage drive or reverse. So the gearbox was clearly gone. When you open the door, it still had the F1 pump sound that it's supposed to have, all that kind of stuff. So it was an interesting issue, but a fairly common one from what I could tell. So I thought, well, okay, if somebody wants a Maserati, they can buy it as a project. I had some local interest, even a car dealer who had some guys that he could get it done with. Some of his employees could have fixed it for him a lot cheaper. Obviously, just find the parts, and then you don't need to find a specialist, etc. But when I was showing a couple of people the car, we checked the oil, and then noticed that my Maserati was starting to get milky. And for those who don't know what that means, that's the cylinder head gasket. And suffice it to say, when the cylinder head gasket on a Ferrari engine goes, it's not exactly like when it goes on a Vauxhall Astra. So the gearbox job at a specialist would have easily been somewhere in the region of a £6,000 job. The engine, probably $7,000. And when you paid $7,500 for the whole car, and then you have $7,000 and $6,000 to pay on top of that 13 grand. Well, even if I had that 13 grand to just fix it without even giving it a second thought, I still wouldn't have, because it's just not worth that to me. If it were the Touareg, the repairs make more sense. But with a Maserati, my confidence had already been knocked. As much as I love the Maserati, it was not as good of a car. Of course, it looked fantastic, it sounded incredible, and it was very fast. But the Touareg had more space, better fuel economy, more reliable, felt more sturdy. The suspension was actually more comfortable than the Maserati. I would say that the Maserati had a better styled interior, but the Touareg was more functional. And it was just a better car, put simply. Not as exciting a prospect, but definitely a better car. Ultimately, I ended up losing a massive amount of money on the Maserati. I sold it for scrap in the end, so I got like £2,500 back for it. Lost 5 grand on it. So that was obviously ridiculous, but that was best case scenario for me. I literally had no other option. And when this one particular guy came to look at the car, he was a dealer, scrap breaker, and a dealership. He came to look at the car, and he had a paint testing tool where it measures the depth of the paint. And he measured the paint on various points of the car and found that both of the front quarter panels had been replaced and were very heavily filled. And there was actually not very much metal left at all on the front of this Maserati. There was so much filler. So, in other words, the car was an absolute joke, and it looked great at the time. The guy who sold it to me was a private seller, not a dealer. And I'm not even aware whether he knew about this stuff. I didn't get the impression that he was the kind of guy who would have known, because when he took me out in the car to show it off, he didn't hold back. He was flying through corners, flooring it everywhere, so I don't think he knew about the milky oil at the time. And I don't think he suspected the issues. He told me straight up when I bought the car, it has warning lights on the dash, but every time we reset them, they just come up again. So he thought that they were false alarms, basically, that it was probably an ECU issue. He could have been a liar, but I choose to believe that he wasn't aware of at least some of it. It doesn't really matter whether he did or not, though, because it's ancient history now. The point is, I ended up getting rid of the Maserati. It was a great time. I loved the car while I had it. I can still say that I've been a Maserati owner for a decent amount of time at least, and I don't regret that in theory. I think that there were just a couple of issues. I think I probably bought the wrong one, and if nothing else, I certainly bought it at the wrong time anyway. Ultimately, thankfully, I still had the Touareg, which was a far better option. Now, around this same kind of time, I actually started doing motorcycle lessons, because I was thinking, okay, let's get rid of the Maserati, maybe get a motorcycle, alongside the Touareg. So I had never ridden anything before, apart from a bicycle. Never ridden a scooter, never ridden a motorbike. So I went for a free taster lesson. Immediately I was on a twist and go 125 scooter, which was actually quite a lot of fun. It could do 60 miles an hour, so it was a pretty hefty little scooter, but it was really fun. I really enjoyed it, and it kind of reminded me of driving an auto, because you never change gear, just twist and go, and it was fun. I did that lesson, it was free, and I decided to carry on. The guy who was teaching me, who was a fantastic teacher actually, he reckoned that I was just ready to go for my CBT straight away, even without the previous experience, because I was already a car driver, so I knew, the rules of the road. I was already familiar with that, and that is half the stuff he has to teach people anyway. So if you're already familiar with that, if you've got the balance, and if you can pilot a motorcycle or a scooter correctly, well, let's just get on with it. So that's what we did. Booked in my CBT, got it done, passed first time. And then the goal was always to try and progress and get my full license as quickly as possible. Now, you can do crash courses. You can do, I think it's something like a 4-day course, and it costs like £400, £600. And they basically teach you in this really quick, intensive way to get the fastest motorcycles you can in the shortest amount of time. Because for those who are unfamiliar with motorbikes, basically the difference between cars and bikes is that when you pass your car test, depending on whether you do an auto or a manual license, you can basically drive whatever you want. Whatever you can afford to buy and whatever you can afford to insure, you can own it. There's no limit. You can't, in my case, for instance, my first car was a 5-litre V10. If that was a motorcycle, I'd have never been able to do that without like an intensive course, which has always been kind of weird to me. That doesn't make much sense, because as a motorcycle rider, I can categorically tell you that it does take a lot more skill to ride a motorcycle than to drive a car. There is no argument there. It categorically does. You have to be a far more skilled pilot on a motorcycle than to be a car driver, because there's simply more going on. However, it's always felt weird to me that you can just pass your test and then drive whatever you want. Because in other words, that means if you could afford to, you could pass your test at 17, and if you're a rich kid, you could buy an Aventador straight away. That to me makes no sense. That is not safe in the slightest, and it's kind of like playing a game with a cheat mode enabled, just pay to win. That's not safe. And we're going to get to some of the reasons why a motorcycle is not always safe later on. Now, to progress further on with the motorcycle aspect of this story, this is still late 2019, so late last year that I'm talking about, and I basically started doing my Module 1 and Module 2 lessons, which basically means that you get on a bigger bike, you're doing, of course, lessons with the teacher, sometimes one other person as well, but at least you and the teacher, and you're basically learning the same principles, but on something with a lot more power. You know, you have a clutch instead of a scooter, just twist and go, etc. I did a little bit of time on a 125 motorbike, you know, those skinny little Yamaha type ones that look like a super bike, but with bicycle tires. I hated that thing. I only rode it once. We moved straight on anyway. He knew I was ready to move on. We went on to these Yamaha MT-07s, which is almost 700cc, naked city bike, 6-speed manual, about, I think, 75, 80 horsepower, something like that. And it's very quick. You know, you're talking like 4.5 seconds to 60 kind of bike. Bearing in mind this is still within the first month or two that I've ever ridden anything, and I'm already on a 700. So it was a lot of fun. I loved these Yamahas. No issues, you know, great lessons. And long story short, I passed all of my tests first time, the practical, the theory, the Module 1, the Module 2, and went from never riding anything before to having my full unlimited CC A-class motorcycle license within 3 months. So of course I was proud of that. I was ready to go, you know, great. I didn't have my own motorcycle at the time. I didn't have a job. It was just YouTube. YouTube wasn't doing that well at the time. So honestly, I just couldn't afford basically to have the Touareg running it, needing to keep some money for potential repairs and getting a bike as well. And also I just decided that, you know what, if I do get a bike, I don't think I'm going to be using it enough to really justify the payout. Because I knew that if I got a motorbike, well, the whole point of getting this A-class license was to get a big bike. I wanted a KTM RC8. And that is still what I'd love if I was going to get a bike, but for the moment, I'm still not. So, past the full test, it actually took the best part of 2 or 3 months after passing my test to actually ride another bike. So there was a massive gap. And on a motorcycle, that could be very dangerous. Going from riding intensively for 3 months with a teacher and a trainer with you at all times, to then having a 3-month gap with no riding at all, and potentially getting onto something on your own for the first time in the wild, well, that's a crucial time. If you're going to have a crash, chances are it'll probably be then. Now, in my case, I didn't. It was fantastic. And you can even watch the results of my first ride here on the channel, because it was the first bike review I ever did, the Energica Eva. And in fact, I rode 2 bikes on the same day at the English Electric Motor Company, the Energica Eva and the Zero SRF. Thoroughly enjoyed both of them, had a fantastic time, and it was also the first time I ever got to use my Predator motorcycle helmet. So that was great fun as well. I really enjoyed that. And it was great. It was a fantastic first day. I was nervous, of course, to begin with, but once I got going, just the total freedom of an electric motorcycle, which again is so similar to driving an automatic car, I just loved it. It was just this relentless power. You just twist and go, never have to change gear. There's no clutch. Because again, on a motorcycle, of course, most of the time, I have to use a manual gearbox, because most bikes just are a manual. And I have no problem with that. You know, again, I passed on a manual bike, just like I passed for manual with cars. I just don't like them. To me, it just seems like an archaic thing. And an electric bike is the antithesis of that. It's the total opposite futuristic thing, and I loved it. So that was great. Now, within this same kind of time, of course, I'm still driving the Touareg. The Maserati is gone. And then we actually came to a point, I can't recall if it was before or after the Maserati. I believe it might have been before, actually, on the timeline. I actually considered trading in the Touareg for a Porsche Cayenne, because the Porsche Cayenne had already been an option that I was interested in. The 4.5 V8S of the first generation, like around 2004. I found a really nice black one. It was like £4,500. I paid $5,000 or just under for my Touareg. So I thought, you know what, this could be a pretty easy deal. Maybe a straight swap with some cash, because the Touareg is rarer, it's worth more, it's probably a better car. But like I said, I'm just one of those petrol heads that always likes something new. I like to collect things or try new cars. I tend to get bored of the one vehicle after a while, or at least so I thought at the time. So I went to drive this Cayenne. When I got to the place, the guy was already in the midst of selling it to someone else. That immediately put me off, because to me, regardless of good or bad business, that's just morally questionable. You know, if you've arranged a date for somebody to come and look at a car, they drive 200 miles to go and see it, and then you're trying to sell it to somebody else as they turn up. To me, that gives me alarm bells. The other guy didn't have the cash to buy it at the time, so he left. Now, I ended up still test driving the car because I thought, you know what, I still want to know what a Porsche Cayenne is like. It's the first Porsche I'd ever driven, and I hated it. I hated this Cayenne. It felt like trash, I'll be honest with you. And of course, this isn't the kind of stuff that I'd say in a review, because I do hope to review a Cayenne at some point, and I'm not going to say it's trash in my review, because just because I don't like a car doesn't mean it's bad. That's why I'm objective even in all of my reviews, because my opinion is fine for me, but if you project your opinion onto everyone else, that makes you a bad reviewer. It's as simple as that. So I'm more than capable of seeing all the good points of a Cayenne. It's just that for me, there were certain things that made me dislike it heavily. Such as, the first thing was it didn't have keyless start. Now, a lot of people would think, well, who cares? That sounds like such a first world problem. Well, yes, it is, but that was kind of my point. When you go from a Touareg, which has, V10 engine, twin turbo, keyless start, etc., and then get into a Porsche of the same time based on the same SUV platform, plus it was the higher performance model, the V8S, 340 horsepower, well, you'd kind of think that the Porsche would at least match it, but it didn't. It felt like what it was at the time, a parts bin special. The doors were incredibly thinly padded, almost like a van. The interior creaked a lot. It felt very plasticky. You had to put the key in to start the engine instead of a starter button, which immediately felt weird to me. Like, why on earth would the Volkswagen have that and the Porsche wouldn't? It didn't feel that quick. The suspension was harsher. It felt taller and narrower than the Touareg in a bad way. I just didn't like the car. Now, I'd still believe that the Cayenne is the single most important Porsche since the year 2000, because it allowed them to become what they are now, and for that alone I have a lot of respect for the Cayenne, and I believe a lot of people would absolutely love the car. Because as many of you know, I am very picky when it comes to a car's interior, because the way I see it is, that's where you sit all the time. You don't sit outside the car looking at it. That's all for other people to look at. I care about what the car looks like from the inside, because that's where I am. I couldn't care less about what other people think of my car. If I wanted cars that other people loved, I wouldn't have bought a Touareg, because nobody knows what the Touareg V10 is. They don't even give it a second thought. It's just another big blue SUV. The Maserati, of course, was different, and that didn't turn out that well. But I always buy cars that I like. I don't buy cars that other people do, and a lot of them clearly show that. With the Cayenne, it was so clearly about other people seeing that you were in a Porsche, and that just didn't do it for me. So in the end, I didn't buy it, as I said. Moving forward again in time, we then skip forward to go back where we were. I test rode those two bikes. Now, at this point in the timeline, I don't recall which one happened first. You could actually double check this pretty easily though. If you look back on my Beards and Bikes reviews, where I do all of the motorcycle tests, if you compare the date on the video with my Predator helmet in the thumbnail, the Zero SRS, which is my most recent bike review. If you compare the date on that video to the date of my Mercedes CL600 review, I'm not sure which one came first. I think the bike did. So that would have been the next thing that I rode. I went back to the English Electric Motor Company again to test ride that bike. That was another fantastic time. I really enjoyed it yet again. In fact, it was even better because I knew the roads from last time and I was more comfortable, could really get into it on the bike. Thoroughly enjoyed the bike. And incidentally, I am due to be going back to the English Electric Motor Company again in future. And I'm really looking forward to that one because I'm actually going to be riding the fastest electric bike on the market, the Energica Ego. And I know that technically the Lightning LS218 is the fastest electric bike in the world, but as I was talking to the chap there who runs the place, he was informing me that Lightning actually has not delivered a single bike to a customer. So their business practices are a little shady at best. Did they build the fastest bike? Technically, yes. Have they delivered any? No. And that's why if you do a Google search for the Lightning LS218, they're all the same bike in the same colour, because there is only one. So technically, the fastest electric bike on the market right now is the Energica Ego. And I'm really looking forward to riding it. It's a pretty awesome bike. It's like the electric version of an MV Agusta. Speaking of MV Agusta, we're going to get to that again later, because you'll have probably noticed there is not a review for an MV Agusta on the channel. So stay tuned for that. But to get into cars, the next thing that happened was I drove, of course, 2 Mercedes-Benz models in one day from Iconic Autos. Incidentally, I'm actually going to be working again with Iconic Autos soon on the channel for 3 more car reviews, sometime next week, hopefully, depending on the weather. So, of course, stay tuned for that. But I drove 2 Mercs on the same day, the CL600 and the C32 AMG. As weird as this sounds on the timeline, those 2 Mercedes were the first cars I'd reviewed since the BMW i8 a year before, 3 months after passing my test, because after that I reviewed that BMW, then I reviewed my Touareg, then I reviewed my Maserati. So I'd only done 3 car reviews, and then I added, of course, 3 bike reviews on top of that as well. So there was a huge gap, partially because of the global circumstances that we're still under at the moment, where I just couldn't work with a lot of places because they were shut down. So I worked with the guys at Iconic Autos, did those 2 Mercedes reviews, and it was great. I was back into the swing of things. I don't know how long ago those 2 were, but not that long. It was within the past couple of months or so. Since then, look at how many car reviews I've done. I've really gotten all in on it. I've driven loads of awesome cars in the past couple of months alone. I plan to continue that, and I've had so much fun. Now, to run through them in chronological order, after those Mercs, I then, of course, went to Lexus of Swindon, and I drove the LC500. That was a fantastic experience because I was specifically not a fan of the Lexus LC500. And if you watch my Gran Turismo Sport review of that car, you'll probably remember I don't like the car in the game, because it just doesn't feel that good. It's too big, it's too heavy, and it's not quick enough. In real life, none of that matters. And it's so vindicating to have something that I've said for years be proven true. For years, even as far back as, the potato cam days in GT6, if you go way back in Quattroporte, the series, and watch my review of the Tesla Model S in Gran Turismo 6, if I recall correctly, I think it was on Fuji Speedway, but I could be wrong. You watch that video, I say in that video, and I believe that was back in the potato cam days, but it may have been later, there are certain cars that you cannot fully appreciate in a game because they don't feel like they do in real life. There are certain advantages in real life that just don't matter in a game, like reliability and space and practicality. And I knew full well that there were certain cars that I did not like in games that I would probably love in real life, and vice versa. That Lexus was the first one that really proved that to me, because in the game I didn't give it a second thought. In real life, it was great. I loved it. Looks fantastic, it's comfortable, gorgeous interior, thoroughly enjoyed doing it. And it was also kind of nice because that Lexus review kind of got me back into the mindset of like working with BMW the year before, like a full-on franchise dealer, brand new car, or close enough. To actually get back into that aspect of car reviews was cool. Then after the Lexus, of course we went even higher up the market to the Tarnack garage in Somerset to drive an Aston Martin Vantage. My first Aston Martin that I'd ever driven, the white one. That was a lot of fun. Of course, I did the review, and you can check out all of the reviews. I'll probably have them coming up here on the screen at the top right. When I mention a certain car, it will come up on the video. So if you want to watch any of them, just click up there. Then after that, I worked with some of my favourite guys that I've met so far in this review world from My Next Car. Now, I don't recall exactly where they're based in the UK, but if you check out those videos, I say it at the start of the video, and I did my first video with them, which was for the Mercedes ML55. which is probably still one of the weirdest reviews I've done, because it's such a random car that most people don't talk about that much, and that was kind of why I wanted to do it. I did that video, worked out really well, it was great to work with those guys, and you could just tell immediately they were like down-to-earth petrolhead guys. Like, they happened to own a dealership, but at heart they were like us. Like, they just love cars. You can imagine that they were the kind of guys who go home after work and like turn on Gran Turismo or something like that. So I worked with them on that one. Then after that, of course, I did still one of the most special reviews I've ever had the opportunity of doing, the Supra. And that was with them again. I went back, I think probably a week or two later, and drove that Supra, worth 50 grand, a mint original 19,000 mile 1995 Supra. Bright red, tan interior. It wasn't auto, which some people didn't like, but I of course loved. And it was great. Thoroughly enjoyed it. In fact, one of you guys, one of the subscribers here on the channel, actually saw me in the car. And that was cool as well. So that was a lot of fun, doing the Supra. And of course, you can check out that review. It's still here on the channel. Then after that one, I worked with a small dealership in Bristol to drive my second Maserati. This was an interesting time for me because it was more personal. You know, I've owned one. I have more of a comparison now to make between that and this one. And that was, of course, the 4200 GT. Unfortunately, it's one of the less successful reviews, which is a shame because it's a cool car. You know, any Maserati's cool. And that was fun to do. It was a very visceral car. And of course, I also released the full POV driving video of that Maserati. It's like 16 minutes long, mostly uncut of just me driving. So you can hear the car and watch me driving it around Bristol. And that's in the ASMR driving series. And that was a lot of fun to do as well. The Maserati was interesting. I prefer the Quattroporte overall, but you definitely have a change of feeling when you drive a Maserati after owning one that hasn't been reliable. Half of me was kind of expecting it to break at any time. And that was interesting. It kind of put a little bit of a dampener on the review, but I still enjoyed it. And as always, I was still honest in my review. But after that one, I then drove what became at the time my favourite car of the year that I'd driven. Apart from my own, of course, I still love the Touareg. But that was with Philip Raby, Specialist Cars. I've worked with them twice. I'll probably work with them again in future. Another pleasure to work with. And that was the Mercedes E55. That was such a cool experience. I expected to like it, maybe. Because, you know, at this point, I've already driven a CL600. I've driven an ML55, which had the same engine. I've driven the C32 AMG. And even before I reviewed stuff, like I told you, first thing I hired after passing my test was an A-Class. So I've actually driven more Mercedes cars than anything else, funnily enough. And I thought, well, I kind of know what I'm getting into. It'll probably feel kind of like an E55, but with 4 doors instead of an SUV. I couldn't have been more wrong. And that's one of my favourite things about doing reviews. When you go in thinking you know what something's going to be like and it turns out so much better, like the Lexus did, the Mercedes was fantastic. That E55 was such a nice car. And without actually experiencing it, it's hard to understand why. But it's just one of those cars that really comes together. Everything about it just falls into place and it was fantastic. Like I said, my favourite car of the year. The i8, of course, was technically prior to a year, so I don't really count that, because the BMW i8 was still a pretty awesome experience. Certainly the best car for showing off in. Opening those gull-wing doors was awesome. But the E55 was fantastic. Absolutely loved it. Then, I believe, probably a week, maybe 2 weeks after that, I went back to Philip Raby again to drive my first Porsche 911. Technically the second Porsche that I've driven, and it was of course the 993 generation Carrera, also here on the channel. That was an experience as well, because of course I'd driven a Porsche before, but it was a fairly negative experience. Now I'm driving what Porsche was known for, the 911. If the 911 lets you down, well, chances are you're not going to like anything that they make. But it was great. The thing that impressed me the most, as I said in that review, was the build quality. It was just built like a tank. Fantastic quality. You could feel it was such a sturdy car. And for a sports car, that's kind of a big deal, because a lot of them feel frail, for want of a better term. Now, I'm just going to, before we go on to the next and probably most exotic car of all that I've reviewed so far, going to jump back into the motorcycle world, because this is where things are not quite as good. See, right up until now, I've never crashed a car. I've never dinged a car. I've never even been in a car crash. And I have my first full year's no claims, which has made a massive difference to my second year's no claims that I'm currently going into, of course. With motorcycles, on the other hand, I wish I could say the same. Because I haven't discussed this on the channel, so many of you probably don't know, but I crashed a motorcycle. And it shook me up. Now, it happened sometime in between some of these other reviews. I don't recall exactly where it happened on the timeline, but I believe it may have actually been before the CL600 and the C32 AMG. It might have even been before that, I don't recall. But I went to a place to review a BMW S1000RR. And any of you who know bikes know exactly what I'm talking about. The former fastest production motorcycle in the world. Now, of course, it's technically not, because my favourite bike, the Y2K, is still the fastest ever, but it was the fastest production at the time. A 195 mile an hour, 1 litre BMW superbike. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, it's the BMW that looks like a MotoGP bike, and it has 2 different sized headlights. It kind of gives it like this weird manic look. It's got 1 big headlight and 1 round one. I love it. It's asymmetrical design. I love that. Not enough vehicles have it. I get on this bike. It was at Bristol, and I rode it around for about 3 or 4 hours. And it was a pretty horrendous day, I've got to say. It was blisteringly hot. I ended up riding this bike through Bristol city centre in start-stop traffic at midday. I'm wearing a Kevlar-lined hoodie, lined and armoured camo trousers, which are made of textile, so they're not breathable at all. Of course, leather gloves, leather boots, and a Predator helmet with a balaclava underneath. Suffice it to say, I was roasting alive on that bike. The bike itself was getting insanely hot because of the start-stop riding. The heat coming off of the side of it was actually beginning to burn my leg through the Kevlar trousers. And it was kind of becoming a bit of a bad day at the time. And I wasn't like losing focus or anything on the bike. I was just starting to get kind of aggravated and kind of annoyed because heat for me, and I'm sure some of you can identify with this, heat makes me angry. When I'm too hot, it makes me very, very touchy and snappy and angry. And I'm always too hot. But most of the time it's okay, but when I'm too hot and the day is hot, it was like a 30-degree day in the middle of Bristol. Plus because, you're in a city centre, so it's all tarmac and brick and buildings, so the heat is just generating. You've got all the people walking around, all the cars driving. So much heat is being generated. I gradually get out of the city. I end up getting lost. I could not find the dealership because I was supposed to drive from the guy's house where he had the bike, which I did. And I was supposed to ride through part of Bristol and go to the dealership. And then at the dealership, we were going to chat about the bike a bit more, swap around the cameras, etc. Okay, all well and good. Problem is, I can't use sat-nav on a motorbike because I didn't have a sat-nav holder at the time, so I was basically using guesswork, just a rough idea of the direction I needed to go. So I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, ended up in Bristol city centre, as I said. Ultimately, I pulled over, phoned up the guy, asked him where the place was. He gave me directions. I wasn't too far away. And this is where things get kind of ballsed up. Because I'm driving down this road, or riding down this road, I should say. And then I see the entrance to the dealership. And I notice that this dealership has a very, very high curb. I'm talking like a 5 or 6 inch high curb. When you're in a car, you don't even notice something like that. When you're on a motorcycle, you'd better notice something like that, because if you come in on anything but a straight angle, you are going to fall off. I mean, try and go up a high curb on a bicycle without coming at it head on. You know exactly what happens. You fall off straight away, because that's just not how bikes work. It sends the balance off immediately. So I saw this curb, I thought, okay, I don't want to fall off. So I took a wide berth, went out towards the middle of the road a little bit. Traffic was fine, didn't, hit an oncoming car or anything like that. Swung around to give the bike a little bit of a better angle. Bump up onto the curb, all well and good. I then look up, because obviously I was looking at the curb, make sure I was getting up it properly, needing to brake or put my legs down to stabilise the bike if necessary. I'm doing maybe 5-10 miles an hour at the most, walking pace basically on this bike, because I'm entering the dealership. Big forecourt, single car wide lane to get into the place, single wide gate. There's no gate, the gate wasn't closed. There was, nothing there as far as I was concerned. I was just riding into the place. I look up and am greeted with a black chain hanging across the entrance at neck height. Now, I don't know what the best rider in the world would have done at that point in time, but when you're traveling towards a chain, even at 5 or 10 miles an hour, a chain which you had no idea was there, that is about to take your head off of your shoulders, the only natural thing to do is not brake and stop, because that would just totally unstabilize the bike and chances are you'd drop it. You naturally duck. So that's what I did. I ducked to avoid the chain, but when I ducked, my wrists went back, because that's what happens when you duck. Of course, when my wrists went back, I snatched open the throttle and was immediately on this, 170, 180 horsepower, 200 mile an hour BMW, going a whole lot faster than 5 miles an hour. And within probably 10 feet, I smashed straight into the front of an Audi A1 that was parked on the dealership forecourt. It was for sale. Like a slightly older generation white Audi A1. Straight into the quarter panel and the headlight. Before I knew it, the bike of course stops dead. The front wheel went into the car. I mean, like inside it, like the car ate the wheel. And I flew over the handlebars and slammed onto the bonnet of this Audi back first. Now, I wasn't hurting at the time. I had some bruises which lasted a few weeks afterwards, but I wasn't hurt at all. My Kevlar hoodie and the trousers and the Predator helmet, they all did their job very well. Didn't hurt at all. But I was very shaken up. And the reason why I was shaken up is actually partially because of my upbringing. See, I mentioned my old man earlier on, and for those who don't know, he did pass away late last year. And basically, he always taught me, my mum as well, but he taught me something which he valued a lot, which is that if you do something wrong, don't do what everyone does. When somebody does something wrong, and I'm sure you can think of occasions like this, you lend something to someone. Could be a car, could be a toy when you were a kid, could be an electronic device, and then that person accidentally breaks it. What do they always do? They come up with some excuse as to why they didn't do it, why it wasn't their fault. They try to downplay it, say, it's not going to be that expensive to fix, is it? You'll be okay. They try to tell you how you should feel about your property being broken. And my old man could not stand people who did that, and neither can I, because they are weak people. People who don't take responsibility for what they've done wrong. Take responsibility, fix what you've done, get it sorted, and move on with your life. Don't be, an attention whore victim, which is what those people are. Take responsibility, get it fixed. So that is exactly what I did. The problem with that mentality is that I had not only the shock of having an accident at significant speed because the bike accelerated so quickly, but now, as well as having the physical shock of having an accident, I've also got the moral guilt of having smashed up somebody else's property in the form of an £8,000 Audi for sale and a £6,000 BMW for sale. And I just couldn't compute the situation. I was essentially in shock. Now, for those of you who also don't know, I am qualified as a first aider and a fire marshal as well as a number of other things. I'm a security officer, fire marshal, as I said, first aider. So being qualified and trained as I am in first aid, I believe I was probably in shock. The signs were certainly there. You feel cold, you don't exactly know what's going on, cold sweats, even though it's a 30-degree day. You can't quite stand up, but you can't sit down either. You feel sick, but you don't. You feel like you're going to cry, but you feel angry. And it's kind of like this weird mix of every possible feeling you can have, which is essentially shock. Now, it may not have been shock. It may have been an anxiety attack, but they're very similar. They have a lot of very similar things anyway. It could have been a panic attack, an anxiety attack, or just shock. I'm not sure which. Either way, whichever it was a bad day. But when the guy got there, the other guys at the dealership, they sat me down. They didn't even see what happened. They just heard the bang. The other guy got there. He noticed the Audi, of course, because the headlight was busted. The bike had actually accelerated so quickly that the impact with the Audi caused the front tire to explode. The front, and I'm talking about the tire on the Audi, not the bike. The car's tire exploded on impact. So the bike must have picked up so much speed so quickly in those 10 or 15 feet. But of course, it's the fastest bike around. Of course it went quick. But even while I was on the bonnet of this Audi, I was still partially underneath the BMW, which doesn't sound like it makes sense because I was thrown over the bike kind of shoulder first, like my left shoulder and head went over the bike, but I was still holding the handlebar, the clutch side, the left side. And somehow, I don't recall how, but somehow my thigh was still under the bike. So the bike must have kind of come with me a little bit. I must have been holding on so tight that the bike kind of came up as well. And the bike sort of landed on my leg against the car. Now, like I said, I didn't break any bones or anything, but I remember the first feeling I had was like the Looney Tunes thing that happens when you just see money signs going across your eyes, but not in a good way. I just saw, like, how am I going to bankroll this guy when I've just smashed up his Audi and a BMW through no fault of my own? But that wasn't the point at the time. It was, how am I going to, rectify this? And it wasn't even just about the money. It was just the feeling of wrecking somebody else's stuff. And I was far more, beat up about it than the guy was. He was, and again, that was why. If I'd been trying to play it off, doubtless he would have been angry. But because he could clearly see I was taking responsibility and felt really bad about it, people are immediately more inclined to work with you, sympathize with you, and not blow their top, but try and actually figure out how we're going to fix this. But the first thing I was thinking when this bike was still partially on top of me was, don't drop the bike. So even right up until that point, I did not want to drop the bike, which of course made no logical sense because I just crashed it into the front of an Audi, but I still didn't want to drop it any more than I already had. Now, ultimately, we ended up just basically having a quick conversation about the two. He said that technically his insurance didn't even cover it because it was on the grounds, and his insurance for some weird reason didn't even cover vehicles driving on the forecourt, which makes no sense to me. I think that they may have been concerned about me potentially suing them, because at the end of the day, if that's the entrance to a location, you should not have a black chain hanging across the entrance. If the chain does have to be there, there should be a warning sign hanging off of it, which there wasn't. It was literally just a black chain. So I suspect that if I'd chosen to sue, even right up until now, because it was only a few months ago, I could probably still sue them right now. But that wasn't my inclination at the time, and to be honest, it still isn't now. Because that's, generally speaking, just not the kind of person I am. So we ended up just settling it with a smaller amount of cash. He said, he's a dealer, so he's not poor, but we basically arranged it in a way that I paid some money towards it. I believe it was $2,000. And that was to cover some of the damage to the bike and some of the damage to the car. Because the main things with the car were it needed a new tyre, a new headlight, and a new bumper. And the bike needed a new fairing, and crucially, a new exhaust. And obviously the titanium exhaust on a super bike is one of the most expensive components you can buy. It's like £1,200 alone. I think it was an Akrapovic exhaust or something like that. So the $2,000 towards it, he said he'd, pay the rest. And that was it. He drove me back to the car. We had a conversation the whole way where we were talking about bikes and cars, and he had no ill will. He actually appreciated the fact that I just took full responsibility straight away. And we had a discussion about basically what I'm talking about now, how that's an important thing, and he agreed. Because he wasn't a particularly old guy himself. He's like probably in his 30s maybe. And that was the end of that, basically. So after that, to cut forward in time a little bit, I then did a couple of the car reviews that I've been talking about, and then came the time to do another bike review. And this is where MV Agusta comes back into frame. For those of you who don't know anything about bikes, MV Agusta is essentially the motorcycle equivalent of Pagani. They're the Zonda of bikes. Yeah, that level. They are that level of motorbike. Super rare, very expensive, incredibly boutique in their construction. Basically the best Italian bike you can buy, if you can afford to. And they also happen to have made some of the fastest bikes ever as well. The one that I was supposed to be going to ride, and that I did go to ride, was an F3. An MV Agusta F3 800RC, which is like the full liveried, hardcore, 3-cylinder 800cc bike. So less power, slower than the BMW, but I didn't mind that. I didn't mind the idea of going back on something smaller. The problem was, I arranged this within 2 weeks of having the crash. So within 2 weeks, I was now getting ready to get on another superbike and riding it in another location which I was unfamiliar with, on roads that at the time were soaking wet because it had been raining, and there were also construction. There was also construction happening on the roads. I drove 4 hours to get to this place, and when I got there, I had no issues all the way. But then when I pulled up in the Touareg, and I looked out the window and I saw behind some railings this MV Agusta sitting there waiting for me. And as soon as I saw the bike, I knew that I couldn't do it. And I felt like such a pussy looking at this bike. But I knew that I can't do this. I'm not ready to get on a superbike again. It was too fast. I don't think I'd fully gotten over the crash itself. I was still probably trying to process exactly how and why and what had happened. And I just started speaking to one of the women who was there. She was the liaison for me riding the bike. And I explained to her about it. She didn't find it funny, and she didn't make a joke or make light of it at all. She thought that was the best possible choice not to do it. She actually complimented me, funnily enough, on what I do, because she asked me, do I own a bike? And I said, no, I ride other people's bikes to review them. And she said, well, that takes some balls to do that, because it means that every time you get on a motorcycle, it's new. So not only do you have to have the skills to do it, you're also learning a new motorcycle every time you get on it. So you've got no point of reference every time. And I hadn't really thought about that, but she was right. Every time I get on a bike, it's a totally new bike that I've never ridden before. And in a car, this is the crucial thing. In a car, it doesn't matter. Because if you get something, if something's a bit hairy or leery in a car, you just pull over. You just sit there, calm down, and when you're ready, move again. On a bike, you can't do that. I mean, technically you can, but you can't just stop on a motorcycle. You're balancing all the time, you're defensively riding all the time, you've got these hot, heavy clothes on, in my case, a crazy helmet as well, which is like looking out of a World War II pillbox, and then everyone on the road is trying to kill you when you're on a motorcycle, whether they know it or not. Just the way everyone drives in a completely dangerous way around motorcycles. Most of the time it's fine. But you start to notice it more when you've been in a hairy situation like that, and I just knew that I wasn't ready. I felt, and I've had this feeling a number of times, and usually when I have this feeling, it turns out to be true, which is kind of creepy. But sometimes I just have a certain feeling on a day, and I think something bad is going to happen today, and it does. And I think I had that feeling on that day with the Beamer, and then I crashed, and I had that feeling with the MV Agusta, so I didn't ride it. Now, of course, in hindsight, you can't possibly say what would have happened, but based on the circumstances, I don't think it would have ended well. I might not have died, but I still don't think it would have ended well. And I just didn't really fancy paying out for another bike. If nothing else, I didn't want to scratch up an MV Agusta, because compared to that, the BMW and an Audi would have seemed cheap to replace. But that was actually the only bad experience I've had in my first year. And it was just on one motorcycle. Nothing like that has ever happened in a car. I've had a couple of maybe close calls in a car, but even then, not really. Because I tend to be more of a defensive driver because of the fact that I'm a motorcycle rider as well. I believe, if any of you watch the Joe Rogan podcast, one of the things that he often says is he believes kids in school should be taught self-defense because it actually reduces bullying. But not for the reasons why you'd think. You'd think it would reduce bullying because kids would fight back. That's actually not the reason. It reduces bullying because learning combat teaches you self-respect. And if you respect yourself, you don't become a bully. Bullies are inadequate. That's why they become bullies. And I've actually started combat training recently. I'm boxing now. And I can attest to it. It does make you feel differently about yourself. It improves your mental state. But again, that's a discussion for another time. And if you guys would like me to talk about that, I could do an episode. But for now, my point is, I believe that everyone who has a motorcycle and a car license drives a car better because you appreciate what it's like to be on the other side. Most people who drive like an idiot around a motorbike have no idea what it's like to be on one. If you put those people on one, they would be wetting themselves and terrified immediately because on a motorcycle, there is nothing protecting you. There are no airbags, no metal. You might not have even thought of this before, but you know what? They don't even crash test motorcycles. Do you know why? Because you don't even stay on the bike when you crash. You fly straight off of it. So who cares if the bike has an impact zone? You're not going to stay on it anyway. That's something which most drivers don't even give a second thought to. You're sitting there in your comfortable big padded piece of metal, and chances are you'll be okay. On a bike, you've got none of that. You've got a helmet, which is 3 inches thick, between you and death, and that is it. And it never bothered me until the point where it did. Now, as I said, I'm actually planning to go back to the English Electric Motor Company to ride another bike. And the reason why is twofold. Well, actually three. One thing is that people who get bitten by sharks often get back in the water again. I don't want this to scare me off of bikes. I don't want to waste the training that I did because I still love motorcycles. I love them in games and I love them in real life, and I don't want this to hold me back, and I'm not going to let it hold me back. Secondly, I know the roads in that area, and that is a crucial difference because everything that you don't need to be stressing out about means that you're going to be better. You know, you can enjoy the ride more, enjoy the drive, and if you don't know where you are, well, you're focusing a lot of your attention on that. Whereas because I've already been there twice, I know the area and I don't have to worry about that. Third thing is, the bike itself is simpler. Again, it's electric, no gears, no clutch. It's just all of these things that you don't have to worry about as much or even give a second thought to. So for me, I'm definitely wanting to go back and do that. I have the confidence that I need to do so. I think that in the case of the MV Agusta, it was just too close in time and too similar of a bike to the BMW for me at that time. And part of me regrets that. Probably the biggest regret, I guess I could say. I mean, it's not like I lose sleep over it or even think about it that much, but one of the only regrets, in fact, of the past year is that I didn't ride the MV Agusta. Because MV Agusta is one of my favourite bike brands, and you don't get the chance to ride one that often, but I believe it was the smart choice to make, regardless of the regret. So I'm still moving forward with bikes. I still want to ride another electric one, and I believe that getting back on an electric one will probably be a good way of getting some of my confidence back as well, which is another reason why I want to do it. In terms of cars, I'm actually driving, funnily enough, another 3 vehicles tomorrow. I would have loved to have included those in this video, but of course we haven't quite finished about talking about cars yet. But those technically, aren't going to be within the first year by the time they're released. So as much as I would like to talk about those are going to be for another time. And then, as I said, next week I'm going to be driving another 3. So potentially another 6 vehicles hopefully coming to the channel. Now, to get back into the cars, there are only 4 left currently, because the next car I drove was, of course, the Vanquish, the Aston Martin Vanquish, the car which technically is the single most valuable vehicle I've driven in the past year. And what a car. I mean, of course it was a special occasion, £185,000 new, I believe, still worth $105,000. And chances are that's going to be going up over time as well, kind of like the XJ220 did. And that was just an amazing experience. The Vanquish gave me what I was hoping the Vantage would. The Vantage was fine. The Vanquish was what I expected of an Aston Martin, and that was why it was so cool. And I know many of you love the way it sounded as well. Then after the Vanquish, of course, I moved to working with another one of my favourite dealers, and they're actually now the dealer who I've worked with more than anyone else, Affordable Prestige Cars in Glastonbury. And I, of course, did probably the weirdest car review I've ever done, technically the only non-performance car I've ever reviewed, the Mercedes R-Class. I wanted to do it because it's an undervalued, misunderstood car, and I know many of you, even the guys at the dealership said that I mentioned things in that video that they didn't even think about the car, that they agree with. So that was fun. That got me in working with them. Then, of course, last week I went back and I drove what is my new favourite car of the year. And since this year of driving is ending on Monday for me, it's my favourite car of the year, the Jaguar XFR. I adore that car. And now that I've driven one and reviewed it, I want one. I want an XFR as my next car. For a while I've thought about different things, but now I know what it needs to be. I need that Jaguar in my life. It's such an awesome car. Check out the review, of course, if you haven't already. I drove two on the same day, an XFR and then the XK Coupe, which I also reviewed a couple of days later. That's already up on the channel. Tomorrow I'm going to be hopefully driving another Jag to add to that mix, along with a couple of other cars, as I said. But in other words, my top 3 cars since passing my test, let's not count the Touareg, because obviously I love that car and I actually own it, which adds that extra layer of importance personally. But my 3 favourites that I've reviewed in order are number 1, the Jaguar XFR, number 2, the BMW i8, and number 3, the Mercedes E55 AMG. Those are my favourite 3 cars from the time that I passed my test right up until now. And of course, as I said, the Touareg is technically in there as well, but it kind of doesn't count in the same way. And so overall, that basically brings my first year to a close. I mean, it's a very long episode of the podcast, but as you could kind of tell, I don't think there was really any way of saying it and condensing it down any quicker than this, because it is a whole episode of it, a whole year, in fact, of experiences condensed down into one video. My voice is a bit hoarse now from talking non-stop for over an hour, but yeah, it's been an amazing year. And for those who may be wondering, the total value of all of the cars that I've driven in my first year of being on the road, from that first Mercedes that I hired after passing my test, right up until now, not even including tomorrow and next week, is in the region of £1.4 million. So that's not bad for a first year. £1.4 million worth of cars. And as crazy as it sounds, the motorcycles that I've driven, or ridden even, in that time as well, from the ones that I learned to ride on to the ones that I've ridden since then, including the Crash, not including the MV Agusta because I didn't actually ride it, is over 100 grand. Over 100 grand's worth of motorbikes. So all in all, in my first year of being on the road, I've ridden and driven and piloted about £1.5 million worth of metal, which is a pretty fantastic first year. I'm looking forward to my second year. My insurance premium and my monthly payments are so much lower because of having a year's no claims. And of course, with the bike crash, it doesn't affect it at all, thankfully, because it's not a bike that I'm insuring, and it wasn't mine anyway. So it was a fantastic year overall. One huge mishap, but still a mishap that gave me some valuable life lessons. And if nothing else, an interesting story. So for those of you who decided to watch the whole video, I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to go back and check out any of those individual reviews, you can either click those cards that are shown on the screen, for the individual bike reviews and car reviews, or the more quick way to do it is here on screen. You should be able to see a couple of different playlists. If you click on Beards and Cars, you'll see all the cars that I've been talking about. If you click on Beards and Bikes, you can see the bikes. And of course, click on the main playlist as well for the podcast. But until next time, I'll see you then. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.